Hi there, and welcome to the Play Therapy Circle. Before we begin, please note this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It does not provide therapeutic advice, and listening does not create a client therapist relationship. All views expressed are my own, and any case examples shared have been de identified to protect privacy. If you're seeking personal support, please reach out to a qualified mental health professional in your area. Hi, and welcome to an episode of the Play Therapy Circle. I'm Kylie Ellison, a therapist, clinical supervisor, and play therapy trainer, and I'm so grateful you're here. This podcast is a space for thoughtful, soulful conversations about child-centered therapy, play-based work, and what it means to show up with presence and compassion, both for our clients and for ourselves. Whether you're a seasoned play therapist, a student just starting out, or someone deeply passionate about working with children, you belong here. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Play Therapy Circle podcast. I'm your host, Kylie Ellison, and I'm so glad you're here. I want to start off by thanking everyone for all of their support of our very first episode of the podcast. It was incredible. We received an overwhelming amount of support from all of you out there listening. So I am so glad you found us and that it was useful and helpful for you. That's always my mantra in this space. So thank you so much for all of the support. And I am so glad to be back. I am currently recording this very late in the evening. I was having all of these technical issues trying to work out how to turn this on. So if anyone knows me well, you know that I'm not very good at this stuff. So I finally persisted and here we are. And I really, really wanted to get this episode out. We've committed to weekly episodes, so please stay tuned every Friday to see the next episode drop. But this episode is all about what is child-centered play therapy. And I feel like as somebody who's been working in the field now for 10 years as a child-centered play therapist, 20 years in the child protection sector, I feel like this is such an easy question, but such a hard question as well, because I feel like as you get more experience, the answer to that question gets more layered. And I feel like in the beginning days, there's so many practitioners out there beginning in the field that want to have a really clear definition for how to explain child-centered play therapy to other professionals, to stakeholders, to families. So this is a really great question. And I think that we will unpack this over the episode. And hopefully by the end, you will feel clearer in your understanding around what child-centered play therapy is all about. But I think one of the first ways, there's so many ways, guys, that you can obviously define this and talk it through because there are so many incredible and important elements to child-centered play therapy. And like I said, I could talk for days about this topic. This is what I'm passionate about and what I believe I'm here to connect with all of you to do. So certainly in the beginning, I guess one of the easiest ways that we often share with those that we connect with is the idea that child-centered play therapy is to children what talk-based therapy is to adults. And sometimes when you mention that to parents or caregivers and you explain to them that children's natural mode of communication is play, as an adult, certainly we are more drawn to that talk space, although I feel like for many adults now, they're often seeking those creative, expressive therapies to be able to process their issues as well. So I think that's really lovely to see that expansion of play into adulthood is happening because I'm also very passionate about that. But I think when you're trying to explain what happens in the playroom and what the application of child-centered play therapy is all about, it's really important to make that distinction that play is their way of communicating in so many ways, similar to how adults use talk-based therapy. So that's a starting point. I think if you were looking for kind of a more succinct definition, I'm going to give you guys a few because I think that's really helpful to have a few tools in your toolkit. But I think one of the ways you can describe it as child-centered play therapy representing a distinctive, evidence-based therapeutic modality tailor-made for children, a language of play that bridges the gap in communication and expression. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. And I think along the way, we will talk more about these different definitions as we go. But I think it's important to understand a little bit about child-centered play therapy so that you can really make that personalized statement for you about what child-centered play therapy means for your practice and your work with children. So we are going to cover in episode 3 the history of child-centered play therapy, because I think that that is a very important element to understanding what child-centered play therapy is all about. And certainly we can't talk about child-centered play therapy without acknowledging very deliberately, I guess, those psychodynamic psychotherapy roots in Anna Freud and Melanie Klein. So we will certainly discuss that more in episode 3, because I think that's really important as a child-centered play therapist to have a really clear understanding of the history and the theories that brought us to modern day practice. But I think that when we're talking about what child-centered play therapy is all about is this idea that it was established in 1947 by Virginia Axeline, who was a student of Carl Rogers. So any of you guys in the counseling space or those who have studied person-centered therapy, you will have heard of Carl Rogers and the amazing work in that space. But we truly believe in child-centered play therapy, and certainly Virginia Axeline held this belief when child-centered play therapy was developed, is this idea that children's ability to self-heal and solve their own problems comes from that non-directive approach to play therapy. So we certainly hold that belief dear as modern practitioners in the space. So I think one of the things to remember when we're talking about child-centered play therapy is very much that we're focusing on the personhood of the child and not their problems. That's really important, that we are acknowledging, I guess, that the whole complexities of everything that has brought the child to your playroom, not just, say, their diagnosis or their trauma. It's so much more than that. So we hold this belief that if we are able to hold a space and a relationship of unconditional positive regard, where we show our genuine interest and qualified acceptance, that the child will have that capacity to explore their world, to unpack their feelings, to understand their experiences, and to heal. That's the purpose of why we connect with children, among many purposes, of course. Certainly a way of being. It's so much around, there's so many factors to this, but I guess it's all about the relationship, connection, and those reflective statements and the communication that we use in engaging with children that allows that healing and growth. So we recognize that the best way to understand children's behaviors and emotions is to empathetically discover the way in which a child sees their world. And I think it's through the eyes of the child that we understand them and we understand ourselves as well. There are so much parallel processes that happen in that space. We really communicate what Gary Landreth references in many of his texts around his mantra of I hear you, I see you, I understand, and I care. We're thinking about that as play therapists, the statements and responses and the way we're engaging with children. It's so important that we're holding that in the back of our mind in informing what responses we use. So I see you and what you're trying to tell me. I hear you. Not only do I see you as the person, but I hear what you're saying and I get it. I understand. And I truly care. And I'm going to show that in both my affect and my reflecting feelings and my emotional statements to the child to let them know, among many other ways that we do it. But that's just a starting point. So that statement is super important in understanding how we connect with children. One of the ways that I guess I've come to see the practice of child-centered play therapy through both my training, my ongoing PD, and my clinical supervision and clinical practice myself is not only just looking at the personhood of the child, and again, around that relationship with the child, but this idea of how problems for children or their maladjustments or their challenges result from an incongruence or a lack of fit a child experiences between the concept of self and the encounters with others or in the environment. So Gary Landreth talks about that in his textbook. So what I mean by that is that when we see children with challenging behaviors, and I'm going to use that statement or concept, but that can mean a broad range of things, right? But when we talk about their presentation in the playroom or outside, and we see these challenging behaviors, what Landreth is proposing is this idea that children are ultimately at their core want to see themselves and have the view of others see themselves as good. They don't want to be perceived in a negative light. but they are struggling with this incongruence between how they see themselves and how the world sees them. And so these problematic behaviors or these challenging behaviors develop, from an inability to reconcile those self perceptions in relationships or environments. And when the child exhibits those behaviors, those manifestations of the child's view of the self and the world occur. So therapists do not view the problem behaviors as representative of a deficit of the child. They always seek to attempt to have the child seen and heard. So I think this idea that ultimately, when we look at CCPT origin being in person centered humanistic counseling, we know one of the principles of that is that self actualization principle, or that belief in our client's capacity to move towards positive growth if given a conducive environment to do so. And that's what the playroom is all about. So when children feel this incongruence, we want to help them to make sense of that and reconcile that for themselves, because ultimately they see themselves as having this potential or having this good, sometimes very much unconsciously. So I'm weaving in there, I guess, Gary Landra's theories, writings, and also psychodynamic psychotherapy there when I'm making that statement. So I think that that's really important to kind of look at it from a few different lenses. But when I heard that idea of that incongruence, that made a lot of sense to me with many of the children that I've worked with, where they have really presented with, say, high levels of aggression or physical aggression. And you can really see that frustration for them in their perception of self and who they want to be. And so we see that in the playroom, and that's part of our job to support them in that. So I think that when we're talking about how we show up in the playroom and what child-centered play therapy represents in terms of those key tenets, it's really around, for us as play therapists, communicating that congruence, acceptance, and unconditional positive regard. And I think that that can sometimes be really challenging when we are presented with kids in the playroom who are highly aggressive or testing, those physical limits, personal boundaries, emotional expression. There are so many elements to that. Even the flip side, really, when you've got the opposition where you've got a child that's withdrawn, refusing to make eye contact or verbal communication. That's not required for play therapy, but it can all be very daunting as a beginning play therapist to encounter those presentations in the playroom. So I always say I work with children of all ages, and I work with where they are at this point in their journey and whatever that means for them. So offering that space of congruence is so, so important. And I think one of the things that we recognize in this space is that this is an evidence-based approach to intervention with children. So we have a good body of research behind us, including meta-analyses that offer us that confidence in what we are doing is well-researched and empirically sound. So that is really helpful when we are talking to parents, carers, and stakeholders to give them that peace of mind that what we do is based in research. I think one of the things that can be difficult as well when we're talking about what do you achieve in child-centered play therapy, or what is child-centered play therapy all about? We've talked about, obviously, the establishment of that relationship, how child-centered play therapy is about providing a space for children to communicate in the way that they know best, which is play. Gary Landers would talk about, and his famous quote, is toys are their words and play is their language. That's often something that beginning play therapists will use as a definition as well to explain, I guess, why this is so different. I feel like when we're talking about that experience of child-centered play therapy and reflecting on my 10 years of practice, I think that one of the things that stands out for me is that relationship first, is that building that connection with a child, offering that safety of that space. There are so many different presenting issues that we see in the playroom. And that's the great thing about child-centered play therapy is we can work with most presenting issues, which is wonderful as well. We have that ability to be able to adapt, which is fantastic. But I think that when you have that establishment of that working relationship, and we know from the research in terms of therapeutic interventions that the relationship is key, that parents often will decide, I guess, within that sort of first meeting with us, if they feel like we are somebody that they can trust their child with, and that's really important. So we're going to cover that in one of our upcoming episodes. All things initial and ongoing parent care consultations. That is a super important part of the work that we do. But I think that when we work to establish that relationship with children, it offers that space of safety and trust where kids can move towards being able to begin to unpack all of that unconscious processing that we know from the research happens in the first 5 years of life. And again, we will talk about all of that in upcoming episodes to come in the podcast. But I think that when children feel seen and heard, when they feel they have a space where they can truly be themselves, sometimes it can just be that it is a space for them to decompress. I often talk to supervisees about the function of the work. At times, we have to remain flexible because we, as play therapists, don't have control over everything that happens outside play therapy. Within our circle of influence is what happens in the playroom. And so sometimes there is many things happening for children outside of play therapy that means that we are holding space for them. And that doesn't have a defined number or prescribed structure. But sometimes the work becomes around helping them to process what's happened to them in the week, helping them, as Virginia Exeline says, to lessen the burden, to leave some of that heavy weight behind in the playroom so that they can feel a little lighter when they exit at the end of the session. So there's so many functions to the work that we do. And I just truly believe in the power of that when we offer a space to kids where they can process that material and feelings and unconscious experiences in that way of connecting with us in that relationship in the playroom. I never want practitioners to ever doubt the impact they can have on a child's life simply by being there. I think that in modern practice, we can often feel the need to constantly be constantly need to add to our toolkit to make sure that we are constantly evolving, and ongoing professional development is absolutely key to our ongoing practice. But for those of you who are beginning out in the field, please trust in those skills of child-centered play therapy to help support children. Ultimately, that is what I have found to be the most successful in this space of working with children. And it's very often that I get feedback from many different practitioners in the field who say that a lot of their undergraduate degrees in terms of, say, psychology or counseling obviously works in so many aspects of therapeutic work, but not so much is there coverage of working with children. And so this approach, this modality of working in child-centered play therapy has so many benefits for kids, but it empowers the practitioner as well to have those skills and tools in their toolkit to be able to connect. But never underestimate the power of the presence in the playroom, the power of that relationship and that dynamic of transference and countertransference, of all of that unconscious processing that happens in real time in the playroom. There are so many elements to child-centered play therapy that we will unpack in episodes to come. But I think when we talk about non-directive child-centered play therapy and that work in the playroom, it can sometimes be difficult to explain to stakeholders or parents or caregivers what are some of the tangible goals and outcomes that children achieve. And I think that sometimes when we put it in language that's understandable, it becomes easier to translate. So no matter what presenting issue or family of origin history or background of the child, here are some of the things that children learn in play therapy that you can have that confidence in being able to share to parents and caregivers. So we help them to learn about having respect for themselves, but more importantly, that feelings are acceptable. That is one of the things that I emphasize to parents when we are starting work in this space. That as a parent myself, I know that we are incredibly time poor and that it can be so challenging to be able to help children to be able to express their feelings and process their feelings. When we have, models of families where it's a two-parent working model. So that becomes challenging. I read recently in the research that our generation, and I'm going to reference myself here because I am in my 40s, so I am that millennial, as you would call it. Our generation is one of the first generations of women in particular who have been expected to work and run a household. We are now seeing, and it is absolutely not causation, there is so many factors to this. But one of the rises in presentations, certainly we've seen in our private practice in the last couple of years, is that rise in what we would call in child-centered play therapy learned helplessness. So that idea of children learning that others will help and do things for them, so those problem-solving skills aren't as good. And that's not in all cases, but we are certainly seeing that a little bit more regularly in our playroom these days. And I think that that's indicative, and that would be my reflections, is that there is some, I guess, linkage there around families just being so overschedulized and really just struggling to kind of get through the week. So being able to hold space for your child when they have big emotions can be really challenging as a parent. So we talk about how in the playroom we can help build that emotional literacy, we can help them to understand those emotions, and we can help them process those emotions because we have that time that we can spend with them. We also really strongly emphasize that importance of working collaboratively with parents. And like I said, we're going to talk about that in an upcoming podcast episode because we want to equip parents and caregivers to be able to take and run with those skills, not just us as play therapists. Gary Landreth talks about how we shouldn't be confining the skills of play therapy to the playroom. It's so important that we're sharing our knowledge with others. So one of those ways is sharing it with parents, which we do. We want to help children to learn how to express their emotions responsibly. So that's why we use limit setting as one of those tools in our toolkit. So there's lots of ways we do it. That's one of them. Help them to assume responsibility, help them to be able to creatively confront problems, like I was just saying before. We know from the research, again, on that decline of free play. I highly recommend checking out Dr. Peter Gray and his research in that space, because in that research, he talks about the decline of free play and an increase in difficulty for children to creatively problem solve, a rise in narcissism, a rise in external locus of control, so many aspects of what we're seeing in the presentation of kids now. So we can help children in the playroom to make sense of that and to develop those skills. We help them with self-control and self-direction, to accept themselves. What a powerful thing for us to be able to do in the playroom every day. I always say it's a privilege and an honor to do the work that we do and to make choices and be responsible for those choices. That's just some of them. I think that when we talk about this work, it's certainly in a definition, we talk about the authentic connections cultivated within child-centered play therapy serve as a blueprint for the child's relationships outside of the therapeutic setting. I really like that as well. So I think there's many ways that we can describe child-centered play therapy. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it needs to feel connected and authentic for you. I certainly, like I've said, shared lots of those examples today, but ultimately when I'm explaining it to parents, it's really about helping them to communicate in a way that feels safe and natural for them to be able to process the things that have happened or make sense of the things that have happened or process those feelings so that they can heal and find that peace in their life. And I feel that's the privilege and the honor of the work that we do. So I hope that this episode has planted the seed around what child-centered play therapy is all about. We are going to unpack so many things in the weeks ahead, guys. We're going to talk about the history of child-centered play therapy, how to set up a playroom, some of those beginning skills of tracking and reflecting feelings. What are the characteristics of a play therapist? What do you need to kind of consider and incorporate into your practice? And so much more. So I want to thank you again for listening. Thank you so much for being here. You, as part of the Circle and the Circle family, are so important in this space. And I hope that this has added to your toolkit in incorporating some of this into your practice. But thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time in the Circle. Thank you so much for being here for another episode of the Play Therapy Circle. If anything resonated with you today, I'd love it if you could follow the podcast, share it with a colleague, or leave a short review. It really helps others find our circle. And if you have a topic or question you'd love me to explore, I'd love to hear from you. This space is for you, and I want it to feel like a conversation. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, you belong here.